Hi, welcome back to Keep It Dirty, a podcast where my guests share their life living functionally and sustainably and their why behind our ever changing environment. I am your host, Leslie Dowling. I am a functional nutrition and lifestyle practitioner, corporate speaker, helping people jumpstart one's path to increased revenue and productivity through restorative health techniques. And today it is my pleasure to welcome my guest, Traci Prendergast. Traci and I actually were fellow alumni from Andrea Nakayama's school several years ago, the Functional Lab.
Nutrition Alliance.
There you go, Functional Nutrition Alliance. It has changed names over the past years, but today we're really going to have Traci speak into not really per se functional health, but really what's going on with our world globally and some personal views and aspects of what she's going through. So again, it's my pleasure to have you, and we'd love to have you speak into what's going on with your current life and your family.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe we could call it functional thought.
I like that because it is, yes, functional. You got to be healthy and try to have a clear head.
It's in the functional realm. Well, it's nice to be back, Leslie. Thank you for having me. This is a bit of an edge for me. We got into conversation recently because I had written something about what's going on in Venezuela because my husband's Venezuelan and I've been following Venezuelan history and politics. We've been together about 20 years, so I've been following since I met him. And I studied, before I met him, I studied Latin American studies in college. And I wanted to share a bit about my story and how my thinking has changed over the years, particularly with Venezuela. And more than I want to kind of debate facts or even claim facts, there's a lot of people who know a lot more than I do. But given how much people are talking about this, I'm realizing I know a lot more than people who are talking, which is not saying much. So that's actually what I want to talk about more than the facts. And yeah, I grew up in the US, in California. We didn't travel a lot growing up, so I had a pretty ethnocentric view of the world. I learned history through public school, and like most histories, you get it's one version of the story, right? And so when I started to study Latin America at a very liberal arts college, I got this very other version of history, which was the US was the aggressor. They've kind of sneakily gotten involved in a lot of governments in Latin America and really meddled where they shouldn't have, and a lot of kind of generalizations that allowed myself to kind of identify with this liberal way of thinking of human rights and basic human decency and trying to avoid war and unnecessary death and whatnot. And I felt really identified with this way of thinking. And, with that, felt like there was some moral superiority in it. And then I studied abroad in college in Chile, 97. And even though it was almost 97, it was like 25 years after the overthrow of Allende in Chile, which the U.S. had played a part in, there was our advisor. It was all University of California students, and she really drilled into us it's the political situation here is still very tenuous. There hasn't been reconciliation between these two sides. On one hand, people were killed, 3,000 people were disappeared and never heard from again. In fact, I have a dear friend whose uncle was disappeared, and that is very raw still. On the other hand, the economy improved tremendously when Pinochet took over. And so there's, a good portion of the population who thinks they're better off. And at that moment, the country hadn't been able to say both things are true. And so we were advised as Americans to just zip it and listen, because the complexity was beyond what we were used to handling in the US. And we do tend to have, most of us, kind of black or white thinking around politics. And that's very, it seems like even more so with the age of the internet. And so that was like my first taste, Chile, of like two things could be true at the same time, but I still felt very identified with this like leftist way of thinking, and kind of maintained that until I met my husband and started to learn about Venezuela. Venezuela kind of broke my political identity, because the more you understand, the more it defies any alliance with any side. These are just humans, trying to get away with what they can get away with. And I want to talk just maybe a little bit about my understanding of what happened in Venezuela as a way to preface kind of what's going on now and how we're talking about what's going on now. And I have some thoughts more about that than so, but feel free to jump in if there's anything you want to add or ask. When I met my husband, Hugo Chavez, Maduro's predecessor, was already in power. He'd been democratically elected, and a lot of people voted for him, including my husband's family. And people said, if he's going to do what he says he's going to do, it's going to be great for Venezuela. And I think he was just a very articulate speaker, less capable in terms of execution and operations. But for a long time, people were with him because the country was thriving. The oil sector was functional and booming, and Venezuela is so rich with natural resources that there was a lot of money. And so his government was able to use that money to subsidize food, to build housing. They were really taking care of a population of people who had never been tended to by the government. And so the party had a lot of support. But slowly over time, he wanted to socialize things more and more, and just like one example is he decided to socialize the oil sector. And so he took all of these really capable people running the refineries and replaced them with his like party cronies who had no experience and often case no education. And over time, they basically ground the oil refinery business to a halt. And I think that's probably when they started getting into more narco trafficking and kind of more illegal stuff, But again, like there are a lot of Venezuelans who are really educated on the history. But, you could say that like he was socialist, he was trying to help the people. Like that's good. And that's kind of like how we've been looking through this lens in the US. But then the socialism was functioning because of the capitalists who had come before. And then they started to get into more criminal activity because they'd gotten a taste for power and money, and they didn't want to go anywhere. And they wanted to keep living the life they were living. And over the years, I think things have just continued to unravel to where the largest exodus in Latin American history happened in Venezuela in the last, less than decade. And some of the stories coming out of there are just tragic, and they defy logic, and they're stranger than fiction and all the things. But Venezuela has been suffering for a really long time. So with the current turn of events, which is that President Trump in the United States has basically ordered an operation to come in and remove Maduro from power. It's fairly well proven that he did not, his last election was rigged. There's a lot of proof of that. And so he's not actually the officially elected leader at this point, but he's got the army on his side and he's refused to step down. So he's been removed from power by the US, which is a bold move. Those are the kinds of things we tend to do quietly, not announcing it. Obviously, this has created a lot of conversation and opinions flying and whatnot, because it's a big event. But I'm seeing, there's like two things. There's the Venezuelan story that Venezuelans should tell. And then there's like what the US wants to do with its resources. And I think as Americans, as US citizens, we have every right to debate how the reaches of executive power and how we want to use our resources and if we want to get involved. But I think what we don't have the right to talk about is what Venezuelans want, or kind of framing this story from our own belief system, and or framing it based on like what's happened in the past throughout history. So I think like Venezuela really, the more I understood, the less I felt I could identify with any side, because it was so complicated and it defied, white and black, good and bad. And I see a lot of what's being spoken to are these very concrete ideas of right, left, good, bad, that don't actually exist in the real world. And so like what I feel passionate about is just that we tell our own stories. And if we don't have personal stories to tell, then we should be listening. We shouldn't be framing things that fit in with our view of the world in order to kind of further support that perspective and make us like they validate our beliefs. But for the people who know, when they see Americans talking about Venezuela and what Venezuelans want, the people speaking without authority just look very uneducated and naive. So that's, I think that's what I want to talk about. Yeah. More than the facts, And I will say that like most Venezuelans are thrilled Maduro is out of power, unless they were employed by the government, in which case those are the only people who have anything to lose at this point, because things have gotten so bad. And you can debate how it happened, what should happen now, all of those things. But it is a widely accepted fact that most Venezuelans are pretty happy to see Maduro in handcuffs and out of power.
Yeah. And first of all, I just want to let our viewers and guests know that for 2026, that I will be bringing people on with what is going on globally and environmentally, and topics of conversation that needs to be heard from people that it hits home personally, and all the different points of views and perspectives, and to respect that their perspectives and point of view. What we see going on now, even in the US, I would have thought 30 years ago that our US, the people here are not safe the way we were years ago. And, not that I'm going to go into details, but I also want to throw something out, and I think people should think about this too, that, what's going on possibly in Venezuela is really on a global level. There's other higher ups that are involved in this. And I'm going to throw this out, but there's something called Mossad, which is Israeli's version of the CIA. We have the CIA here. Not that I'm thinking, but I'm thinking out of the box. What's really going on here? Is this really at a government level, or is there also other things going on that has been going on for years and years? And so that's another thing that, I think our voices need to be heard. There's a lot of levels here of questioning. There's a lot of pieces of the puzzle that we're all trying to kind of formulate in our minds. And for me, just kind of parlaying into what's going on locally here in the US is just unimaginable. And it's like, where are our rights? And so we are all becoming this melting pot of individuals that our voices are being stripped from us. So Traci did make a comment on some things that she posts, and I just it resonated because she was so upfront, and it was so, it hit home because her husband is Venezuelan. And so her perspectives and views are just really honestly how you're feeling just over the years, what you have seen in the perspective of the eyes of somebody that is living through things that maybe a lot of people are not aware of. So, in a roundabout way, I'm hoping that people, my viewers and listeners, are really just thinking things through. And, it is a very ever changing environment and what's going on ever changing globally. So, I'm just so happy that you came on here today because it's so apropos because all of this is happening now. It is now January 12th. So this conversation will be on my several platforms this Wednesday on the 14th for everybody to listen to. And this is my calling in life, to get people on here for people to start thinking and to start joining together and just having discussions and conversations. So, I'd like to hear more, Traci. I mean, how are your children absorbing and trying to
Yeah.
figure out how is that affecting the children, and how old
Well,
are they?
I think there's like a real opportunity here. Unfortunately, the adults aren't able to rise to the occasion, but there's an opportunity to grow critical thinking skills with this scenario. And I asked my son the other day, like, I was asking, like, what are they saying about this in school? And he's not necessarily speaking up, but he's hearing that other people don't know what they're talking about, and they're
Mhm.
talking. So I think there's an opportunity for all of us to improve our critical thinking skills, because I think everyone, like most people, when you drill down to their beliefs, there's something they're protecting that I often agree with, or can honor or find value in. And it's just the ways we think things need to be protected that might differ. But I find more and more, if you can just like have a reaction, but don't let that stop you from understanding. Don't believe everything you think is my
Sure.
favorite bumper sticker says. So that's, I think, because like my husband's parents are still in Venezuela and these stories are real, I think they're getting a chance to understand the complexity. And obviously there's like the whole human side of this, which is like families can't be together, they're all over the country. My kids have not been to Venezuela, and they don't know that part of their history, because we keep waiting for things to get better, and they keep getting worse.
Yeah.
And so it hasn't felt safe. And then less so as an American, as Americans, to come to Venezuela in the last couple of years, with increased kind of kidnappings and human rights abuses. It's felt like more and more sketchy call for them to visit. So I think they're handling it better than the adults, honestly. They're more open-minded. And as long as they're, not being indoctrinated by one side or
Mhm.
the other, but just really, we try to talk about all the sides. And 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 that can be, um, yeah, I like, you might not be a fan of Trump, and he's clearly acting in his own self-interest, but who doesn't? But like, and there's a lot of questions here about, is this an overreach on the part of executive powers? But from the Venezuelan side of things, they're like, somebody used their power, and like the oil is the least of their problems, honestly. So like multiple things can kind of be true at the same time. And we need to hold more of that, really. Like, it's not serving any of us, the division, telling stories about othering people, feeling morally superior. Like, most people care about something, and you might not agree with how that manifests, but I think we're just losing the ability to actually debate and hear each other. And like, Venezuela is one of those things where, when it first hit international news maybe a decade ago, I was so shocked. All of these thinkers and writers I really admired were speaking out and getting it wrong. And I realized, wow, this is happening all the time. I just don't most of us don't know. We're not experts on these things going on in the world. And so this was a case where I actually knew enough to know that they were just using their worldview and the voice they'd developed and their platform to like basically further themselves and, taking advantage of what was going on to further their own agenda or, position, feelings of moral superiority underneath, and I recognize this because I did the same thing and probably still would be if I hadn't married a Venezuelan. So I think anytime we feel moral superiority, that's like red flag, to learn more.
Yeah. And I think also just having you on, it just drew me in. Like, here is a woman who is married to somebody who's from Venezuela. It hits home. He has family there. So who better not to have someone that maybe is far removed or in the thick of just growing, evolving, and nurturing your children and knowing that they have family there and everything else that's involved in that. I think also that our country actually, it's all that fake news and journalists years ago. The reason why people went into journalism is because they seek the truth for story on what was really going on. That has shifted and changed dramatically. And I think like the way that you are taking a stance and just listening, that at every angle and every side, there's positive and negative, and we're all human. So we have to be more human to just sit back and not point the finger. And in a lot of ways, it's sort of like functional health, where we're all bio-individual. We got to sit and listen to the story because everybody has a different story. And to take that into consideration and not start pointing the finger and saying, well, this is what I think it is, when we might not have story, we might not understand all the facts, because there's a lot going on that's been thrown to us in many angles in this country overall. But having the perspective of you coming on today, I really felt so passionate for you to speak. And so, I really appreciate that you took the time today to speak into this, for people to really open up their minds more and maybe just saying, all right, you know what, this is another avenue of something that maybe I didn't consider. And, I dated someone from Venezuela in college, and his father was in the army, and so I would hear story from him. But that was years ago. What's going on now is absolutely concerning, but we need to take a step back and be a little more objective and just listen and get everybody's point of views. So thank you. I really appreciate your time. And I really want to have you back on as I have more and more guests on about what's going on globally. And it does affect us as functional health practitioners on a spiritual level, the stressors, everything that's involved in relationships, the dynamics, having loved ones over there right now, and just wondering what's going on with the news. There's always breaking news, so it's interesting how to navigate through this. But when you are personally involved with someone that actually is from there, that's a whole nother story. So
Yeah.
I'm
I think
hoping that,
that's why I'm saying, can we just listen
yeah,
to people's first
yes,
person stories? Because it is so hard to know what to believe. And the more information we have, the harder it is to know what's actually true. And so
sure.
I feel like that's one thing where you just know intuitively when you hear someone's story, and it when it's true. And so I think at the very minimum, we can trust that as a way
Mhm,
forward,
mhm.
and like put down the information a bit and lean more on our humanity. On the oldest way of communicating is telling stories. And can we go back a little bit to that, and away from reading the news and
Yeah,
thinking we know what it means.
absolutely. And just let's try not to be always fight or flight, breaking news. I shut down that breaking news that you turn on the TV, that's all you see. And just take a minute to just rest and just take a deep breath. And like you said, on a human level of what we need to just realistically just sink into and yeah, just try to navigate through this world and not just be ready to jump or just take a seat and listen, simply listen and get everybody's points of views. So, Traci, what else can you share with us? Anything else that you'd like to bring to the forefront for today? Because it's been an interesting and just real conversation, and I appreciate that.
Let's see. I mean, I've been having this feeling with other kind of really hot current events too that are going on, or like what's going on in the Middle East too, but I felt less emboldened to speak out because I don't have as much personal history there, although I have Jewish family, but I have felt the same thing, which is like we're in opposite corners, like kind of shouting separately. And the truth, if we could really take in what's actually happening on all sides, we wouldn't be yelling as much because, man, it's complex and it's hard to know how to solve the problems. And I think we want to see ourselves as heroes in some way. And that's part of what has us trying to solve the problems, when there's like some humility in like, let me understand first. And then it's like, well, now that I understand, I'm not gonna hold some hard line, but I think, what I'm talking about here is maybe more impactful than drilling down on what I think our government should do or whatnot. So yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunities for us to exercise this, and it's becoming an imperative. Yeah, I try to just listen to people more and more who have different beliefs, and more I find, wow, we actually have so many shared beliefs. We just have different ideas about how we think these can be achieved.
Yeah, and you don't know everybody's story. Like, you are directly having an impact with your husband from Venezuela. And people don't know my story, that my grandmother emigrated here, and my father was first generation from Poland, but a lot of our family, the Italian side, fled to Venezuela. We have a lot of family there. They're third cousins. I personally don't know them, but as you're speaking and telling me this, you just don't know everybody's story. So all of a sudden it hit me, and I said, oh my God, my grandmother's side of the family have cousins that live there, and my Uncle Rocco still keeps in touch with them. I wonder how it's affecting them. So we live in a melting pot, and somehow we're all connected, on a humanistic level, and also it hits home with a lot of people. So I really appreciate you spending the time today to speak into this. And I ask everybody, for people that want to reach out to you, because you also are functional nutrition and also embodied midlife guide, using food, movement, and mindset to help women feel better in their bodies again. How can people reach out to you?
The best place is, through Instagram or my website, traciprendergast.com. And you can find me on Instagram or Facebook too. So that's probably the best way. Yeah.
Wonderful. And again, Traci, I just wanted to thank you and thank our viewers and listeners, as I will be having just really great conversations for 2026. And please rate, review, and subscribe to keep this podcast going, to have more wonderful guests like Traci to be on my show. And just remember to get out there, ground with Mother Earth, and keep it dirty.